We've all heard of Boudicca, or Boudicca, and her rebellion against the Romans, but what do we really know about her? I'm joined today by Elodie Harper, who's just written a novel about Boudicca and her daughters, and is here to tell us all about it. Welcome to Future Imperfect. Hello everybody, welcome to another edition of Future Imperfect with me, Jason Kingsley. I am very excited today. It's actually quite windy outside, so I hope you can't hear any of the actual storm. But I've got an author with us called Elodie Harper, and we're going to be talking all about Boudicca or Boudicca. Now, maybe that's something we should get right from the very beginning. But Elodie, could you introduce yourself first, please?
Hi, Jason. It's lovely to be here with you. Yes, it is rather windy today, quite like the Iceni heartlands, the wind whistling over the fens. So I'm a writer who focuses on the ancient world. I've written a trilogy based in Pompeii called the Wolf Den Trilogy, which focuses on the forgotten women of the Roman town. And my latest book is Boudicca's Daughter, which does what it says on the tin, really, as far as books go. It's about the daughter of the legendary Iceni queen, Boudicca.
And is that out in bookshops at the moment?
It certainly is, yes. Out in paperback at the end of April in the UK and already out in paperback in the US.
Wonderful. Can I start with her name?
Yes.
So when I was a kid, it was always Boudicca.
That's right.
And I don't know why.
So basically, it was a typo from the original Latin recorded by Tacitus. So Boudicca is the ancient Celtic British name, which is found, I believe, elsewhere, not just in relation to the Boudicca who's so famous, you know, in other inscriptions as a name. And Tacitus recorded her name, but the monks over the centuries wrote it slightly differently. And so we got Boudicca for a while, and then they worked out, oh no, that's not quite what was being said in the original.
Well, that's great. So there's an initial connection there. So Boudicca herself, let alone her daughter, is such an important, seems to be a very important figure. Is there a reason why you and your readers find her particularly attractive? What is the appeal about this particular figure? Is it the rebellion side of it, or?
So I think she's had different appeals throughout history to sort of different generations of people. I mean, the Elizabethans gave her red hair, so that's how we think of her, whereas in fact, in the original text, she's not recorded as having red hair. And then the Victorians sort of had her as a kind of Britannia figure, you know, celebrating empire, which is very strange given she was fighting the colonial rule of the Romans. But, you know, each generation makes something of her, I think. The reason why she continues to fascinate is she was a female general and leader at a time when we don't associate women taking on those roles. And aside from Hannibal in Carthage, she's one of the kind of great villains to ancient Rome who nearly succeeded in defeating them on the battlefield. She defeated the Ninth Legion, she destroyed a number of Roman towns and nearly succeeded in driving them from Britain. I think for us today, you know, with sort of modern developments in archaeology, when we're beginning to understand that women in the ancient world who belonged to different cultures other than ancient Rome or ancient Greece had a lot more political and military power than we imagine. And the clues for this have always been there. I mean, in the original Latin text, Tacitus, who is the most contemporary historian for Boudicca, he knew Agricola, who was his father-in-law, who had actually fought against Boudicca. So he had access to, if not quite an eyewitness of the Iceni, as close as you can get from the Roman side. And he has this throwaway line that the Britons don't distinguish between the sexes when choosing military commanders. Now, for us today, that's not as surprising as it would have been in Roman times. I mean, it's unthinkable for instance, a military general or a Roman emperor to have been a woman. But for the ancient Britons and other Celtic people of this time, this was not unusual. Women could hold very significant military and political power. Boudicca was not the only British queen at this time. There was Cartimandua, the Queen of the North, and she actually was a collaborator with Rome. So she was an ally to the Roman occupiers, whereas Boudicca famously ended up being a rebel. But I think that even today, I mean, although, you know, arguably we want equality, it would still be pretty unusual to have a female general today, I think, you know, and female heads of state are still pretty rare. But at that time, it was actually quite common among the Celtic peoples, but not at all common for the Romans.
That's interesting because the Romans obviously had this vast empire, very well organized in terms of sort of military campaigns and infrastructure and communications. And they kind of bash up against this different philosophy about leadership and warfare. I think, if I remember rightly, and the ancient world is not my particular area of study, but they had very different fighting styles as well. Is that right? Is that something you talk about in the book at all?
I mean, I have to be honest, my interest was more in Boudicca as a family drama rather than getting
Okay.
into the nitty-gritty of the fighting techniques. But you're absolutely right. Yes, there were very different fighting techniques. I mean, the Britons and the Celtic people in sort of France and Spain kind of famously fought semi-clothed. Of course, this is Roman accounts, so you have to take it slightly with a pinch of salt. The idea of them sort of rushing into battle naked in a frenzy, you know, their bodies painted with Woden tattoos, their helmets with kind of animal hair and feathers and all the rest of it. So they came across as quite wild. They also made use of chariots in warfare to quite great effect. Julius Caesar talks about the British chariot fighters when he kind of stuck a toe into ancient Britain and then decided, actually, no, I'm not going to try and conquer this place. So yes, their fighting style was different. And certainly Boudicca's final battle, she was hugely outnumbering the Roman force. But in the end, it was the very kind of dedicated and systematic military tactics of Paulinus, the general, facing her that defeated a much larger force. You know, he chose the site of the battle and was waiting there for her. So he kind of made the most of the lay of the land. And in the end, kind of overwhelming force and frenzy wasn't enough to defeat her.
So what about, are most of the sources we have, are they all Roman?
All Roman.
Right.
This is one of the really big problems when looking at the ancient British people and Boudicca in particular is, you know, the sources are not hugely sympathetic. I think there's a significant lack of curiosity about customs and beliefs. So we really just get another culture filtered through fairly hostile eyes. I would say that Tacitus is, probably for his own reasons of trying to kind of use the trope of the noble barbarian versus, you know, decadent Rome, is perhaps more sympathetic to Boudicca than we might think, in that he gives her very kind of dramatic speeches, which are all made up.
Yes, because he's somebody who'd have to be there taking notes, wouldn't they? And
Exactly.
actually understanding ancient British, the language, so as opposed to Latin. So
Precisely, yeah. He was there, but he wouldn't have spoken her language. But I think we can take enough from it. I mean, I chose to paraphrase some of her speeches because they are so famous and so connected to her in the legend. You know, why not? Tacitus was an extraordinary dramatic writer, and he conjured this image of Boudicca that has lasted through the centuries. It's certainly where we get the information about her daughters, for instance. So the way that they come into it, and the sort of fascination I had, is when Boudicca's husband, Prasutagus, the king of the Iceni, died, and he was like Cartimandua, the queen I mentioned before, the queen of the north. He was a client king to Rome, so he collaborated. And he left his kingdom to his two daughters and to the Emperor Nero. So he was trying to have the client-king relationship continue through his daughters, so that they would continue to collaborate with Rome. Now, there's kind of all sorts of questions as to why he didn't leave the kingdom to Boudicca, for instance. And there have been suggestions by historians that perhaps she was always more anti-Rome than him. And so, you know, he was trying to make a compromise and accommodate everyone. But the Roman procurator based in London, Decianus, responded really aggressively to this will. And he sent Roman soldiers to the widow of Prasutagus, who was Boudicca, and he had her flogged and the daughters raped. And it was this outrage, together with kind of oppressive Roman tactics generally, that caused Boudicca to rise up and to sort of rally the Iceni people and the neighbouring tribe, the Trinovantes. But the thing that I found interesting is that we are not given the names of the daughters, nothing about their personalities, their lives, what happened to them after the rebellion. You know, we get this image of them on their mother's chariot while she goes to muster warriors, which is also recreated in the statue that we've got opposite the Houses of Parliament, this kind of Victoriana figure of Boudicca and her daughters. And, you know, they are recorded in history only for the attempted act of humiliation meted out by Roman soldiers, an act of sexual violence. And I just felt quite aggrieved about this, that this is all we know about them. This one event in their lives that, Rome used to try and blot out all sense of them as people or as potential leaders.
So where do you go in your narrative then? So you investigate their lives, based on the sort of paucity of facts we've got, but you sort of conjure up some situations for them, do you? Sort of using the references you've got, but sort of extrapolating.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, honestly, the references are so brief in terms of the daughters themselves. You could imagine anything. I made them the absolute upper limit age-wise that they were likely to have been, because it's possible they were very young, which is clearly not a story that I would want to be telling. We don't know, but it is possible that they were young adults at this point. I thought it was important. Obviously, they had to have names.
Yes.
Very distinct personalities and very different relationships with their mother, and responded to the rebellion in very different ways. I also felt that there's one fact that's been handed down to us by Rome, that they were both raped, was something I did not want on the page, because I feel it's kind of dominated their story for so long. And also, you don't have to see a graphic or read a graphic description of sexual violence to understand that it's horrifying. And I wanted to explore rather the impact that had on the daughters, Selina, the eldest one, who's the main character of the novel, and Belenia, her younger sister, and on their mother, and on the wider family as well, because, they've got uncle and aunt and cousins too.
Do we know what actually happened to Boudicca historically? I mean, did she get executed? I can't remember.
So Tacitus says she took her own life.
Right, okay.
And he is the most contemporary source that we have. A later Roman suggests that she died of illness, perhaps of injury, after the battle, and that she's buried somewhere. So those are the two Roman accounts, and without giving spoilers,
you interpret those accounts,
the way that you can.
What about the archaeology? Because obviously this is a very famous kind of, if you talk about school history,
yes,
Boudicca's rebellion is a sort of thing they talk about in that sort of, that type of history that's summarized for children in many ways. They don't talk about the darker sides of it, but they talk about the rebellion and against Rome somewhat proudly as well, actually, and from what I remember from my school days. But what about the sort of professional archaeology side of it? Is there much archaeology from this period? I think one of the problems is there isn't too much, or
no,
it's quite few and far between.
I mean, one thing we do have, though, is something called the Boudiccan lair, which is when she burnt London and Colchester in particular, which is where a lot of the archaeology is, and also St Albans. There survives in the archaeology a whole layer of kind of obliterated material, basically.
Wow.
And so that is how we date stuff from her time period.
So she's literally left a mark on the earth.
Yes.
In terms of ashes and...
Yes. And the foundations of today's Colchester Castle, which is very ancient anyway, but its remains are the Roman temple of Claudius that she burnt. So you can stand essentially in the spot where all those civilians died when they were killed by Boudicca.
Because she wasn't gentle with the Romanized Britons at all, was she? I mean,
no.
Do we know what was that? That was again written about by the Romans, I presume, so therefore is likely to be biased, or at least biased in their favour, and part of the shock of the story, perhaps. But did she burn it down and slaughter them all?
We don't know for sure, but it looks like it. Again, I tended to favour Tacitus over Cassius Dio, a much later Roman chronicler. So Tacitus kind of says she sacked the towns with all the kind of violence you might expect from such a rebellion, essentially. So kind of awful, not dramatically out of the ordinary for warfare at this period, which was brutal and horrific. For the Romans, though, they were not used to being on the receiving end of this sort of violence. They saw themselves as people who sacked towns, not whose towns were sacked. So a lot of their shock would have resided in that. And Duncan Mackay, who's a really wonderful non-fiction writer about Boudicca in his book Echolands, sort of talks about Paulinus, the general who went on to defeat Boudicca, that he may have been radicalized by returning to the sites of these towns where there would have been such a lot of evidence of death and destruction. And in telling her story, I didn't want to ignore this aspect. Obviously, it would be pretty difficult not to sympathize with Boudicca over the Romans. She was an oppressed person fighting both sort of personal oppression of her family and violence against her family, but also in a wider sense, the colonial power of Rome. So, of course, it's normal that we would sympathise with her and with her rebellion. But at the same time, I just felt it would be dishonest to look at this as kind of heroic, purely heroic, and that there was not a great deal of suffering of wholly innocent civilians at the same time. It wasn't just soldiers that she killed. And the Romans were even more brutal, really, in the aftermath.
Do you think she saw the Romanized Britons as sort of cultural betrayers? Is that why she destroyed it? Or was it just trying to erase Rome from these islands? It may not have been that complicated. It may have just been, I don't want them here.
I don't think we know. Obviously, her husband was a collaborator with Rome. And for Selina, the eldest daughter, who is the heart of the story, because the book is split, it looks at the rebellion, but then actually more of the book looks at the aftermath of the rebellion and the rebellion itself, and the action moves to Rome. And a lot of the book is about Selina, Boudicca and Prasutagus' daughter's relationship with Rome, because she's got this father who was a collaborator with ancient Rome. And like Queen Cartimandua in the north, there were huge benefits sometimes for being a Roman collaborator. The real Selina may have spoken Latin. She may have been educated about many things about ancient Rome, and some British people sent their children to ancient Rome to kind of get a political and cultural education to try and collaborate further with this power who had come in. But Boudicca, of course, rejected it. We don't know if that rejection was lifelong, whether it was something that came after her husband's death and all the terrible things that happened to her family. For me, I imagined it that she has quite significant racism against the Romans, that she does see people who marry Romans as collaborators as well. So very early in the book, there's a scene where Prasutagus is mooting the idea that maybe one of the daughters could marry an important Roman official as a means of trying to solidify their position, which she is very opposed to. So, yeah, we can't know, is the honest answer.
Yeah, I've read some interesting archaeology books about the sort of Romanization and what it actually meant for some people. And there was the trade, there was merchants, there were goods that came from further abroad. There was a significant upside in terms of commerce and culture, possibly, but there's also the downside of it crushing your own indigenous culture as well, which is difficult.
Yeah, they enslaved a lot of people.
Yeah.
I mean, they stole human beings and they stole natural resources, and their kind of straight Roman roads were there to take the natural resources of Britain out of the country and to feed the sort of coffers of their own empire. So they kind of stripped the country, and Tacitus and Cassius Dio, one of their points of agreement is that part of the rage of the upbringing was the financial burden of this colonizer taking so much in tax, in goods, theft, basically, just bleeding the place dry.
Yeah, and taking it back to Rome, which was a voracious beast that needed feeding and maintaining. Yes, I think that was the further afield you go, I guess, the more exploitative the frontiers can be, I think.
And there would probably have been a huge sort of variety in that, depending on who was in charge. So quite famously, after Paulinus, a much more conciliatory procurator came in who wanted to sort of accommodate with the British people more than his more oppressive counterpart. So it could vary. It wouldn't have stayed constant. And of course, for the elites, Prasutagus, Selina's father, may have benefited personally. Like Queen Cartimandua, the Romans came in and rescued her when there was a rebellion against her much later. So it will have been very complex, very muddy. And that was something I wanted to explore as well, was the moral complexity of the rebellion, that it wouldn't have all been clear cut. A lot of people would have been caught in the middle. And Selina trying to survive the aftermath of it in deciding, is she going to continue to seek revenge? Is she going to try and, if not make peace with Rome, then create some kind of relationship with Rome and with her own past?
So as you're writing this, and obviously you're extending the real world into kind of historically based fiction, do you find your narrative path shifting because you're sort of drawing threads together in ways that you didn't actually initially expect they would come together in your writing? Is that something that happens, or did you plan it out from the beginning to the end?
So I tend to have a rough plan, but no, definitely this book felt quite morally challenging to write at times in terms of what happens after the rebellion and what happens to Selina and the choices that she makes. It was complicated as well because the first section is purely from the point of view of Boudicca and Selina. And then after the rebellion, we get Paulinus, the general who defeated Boudicca, as a point of view as well. And in writing his point of view, I mean, I felt it would be a very dull book if he was a cardboard villain with no complexity or kind of morally grey areas of his own. So quite a lot of the relationship between Paulinus and Selina is very grey and very complex.
Did you find your sympathies shifting as you wrote the book, as the narrative developed? Do you find that you thought you'd start completely against this person and completely on this person's side, and as you wrote it, you found it becoming more grey and nuanced?
Yes, definitely. And I think it's quite hard to write from a character's point of view and not be influenced to looking at them perhaps a bit more empathetically than you did at the start. I was chatting to Sarah El-Arifi recently about her marvellous book, Cleopatra, as to why she chose to have the relationship between Julius Caesar, who was pretty monstrous, and Cleopatra as a love match rather than a kind of convenience affair. And she said it's to give Cleopatra some agency in the story because that's more enjoyable to write and to read. And I felt similarly with Selina, that if she was just kind of constantly oppressed throughout the book and feeling nothing but hatred, that would be incredibly uncomfortable to write and to read.
Yes.
And that actually if the relationship with Paulinus was more complex and sometimes uncomfortable in a different way in terms of looking at him as an individual as well as what he represents, that would be more interesting.
I suppose it makes it more multidimensional, doesn't it? Because when you're writing from the POV of somebody who you initially expected to be fairly monstrous and horrible, you sort of almost start analysing their motivations and sort of second-guessing yourself, perhaps, and thinking, actually, I don't really want to feel sympathy, but I kind of understand that aspect of their personality.
Yeah, you can find them awful and find what they did hateful, but it is fiction and it's written a very, very long time ago. And I think that's really important as well. It's not like writing a book about similar events in recent history or contemporary times where the attitudes and sensibilities are so profoundly different. So it was incredibly common in this period for warfare to be unbelievably brutal and horrific. And this was just the accepted aspect of war. This is how people behaved. And when people were conquered, if a British tribe conquered another British group, it wouldn't be pleasant for the ones who were conquered. So Rome was the most aggressive colonizer, there's no question, in Western Europe at this point, of course. But it doesn't mean that other people were less warlike.
Give them half a chance, they'd have probably done something similar if they could, perhaps. I mean, culture was very different, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, even if they weren't sort of aggressive colonialists, it was incredibly violent. I mean, one of the things that I wanted to do to try and get that across is the Druids, who were hugely important to the British people at this time. The Romans said that they practiced human sacrifice. Now, the archaeological evidence is kind of split on this. They may have done, they may not have done. I chose to have it that they did, and Selina is a Druid. And so this is part of her life and part of her culture. And so, people may feel uncomfortable occasionally liking or empathizing with Paulinus, but also, Selina, you find yourself rooting for Selina with what she says about human sacrifice as well, which should also be a kind of cultural shock. And I do think that women who have been obliged to cohabit or collaborate with or accommodate conquering powers have been really vilified throughout history. I mean, similarly, why I wanted to write about the women of the brothel in Pompeii, who've also been really sort of dehumanized and villainized, is I think, women in ancient times faced some really impossible choices, really difficult choices, and they deserve their full humanity. We still deserve to look at that with some sense of empathy, I think.
So let's go back to the Druids, because the Druids are fascinating and probably completely misunderstood, and there isn't much we know about them, and there's an awful lot of modern day kind of Druidism as well, of dubious historical basis. So how did you go about constructing the sort of the religion or the religious powers for this work? And how did you avoid, well, if you did avoid, the sort of modern glossing of things like druids?
So I kind of completely ignored the modern aspect, which is not to rubbish it at all.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know enough about it. So that is not in any way to say that they're wrong or not to be trusted or anything like that. But I wanted to create something that was my own and kind of...
Yeah, based on history, based on the history. Yeah.
I mean, also, the history is so flimsy and scant that it's really hard to know. So again, we've got this culture filtered to us through Rome. We know that the Druids were an incredibly powerful class of people, politically, culturally, legally, and religious-wise. So the separation between religion and every other aspect of life is a very modern phenomena. And in the ancient world, these things were all very jumbled up. So Prasutagus, and that is his real name, his name means magic chief.
Oh, brilliant.
Which is great.
Yeah.
And from that, I thought, well, maybe he was a druid. It sounds potential that he could be, in which case his eldest daughter, because women could be druids, maybe Selena, a word that I chose that means sight, maybe she's also a druid. And that's where part of her power comes in. And we know that they had different classes of people. So there were druids, there were warriors. And so I invented this whole structure where, Boudicca is from the warrior class. Her original name is Katia, actually, not Boudicca. Boudicca's a title that she adopts in the war. And yeah, so one daughter, Belenia, is of the warrior class. Selena is druid class, but both Selena and her father are considered twice blessed, which means they're both warrior and druid. That's something I just invented. So yeah, you could invent quite a lot. And what I used to sort of build their magic system, we know it was very kind of related to nature, to the sun, because of the positioning of things for sunrise and solstice and stuff like this. And we also have sort of names of some of the gods. We have some of the legends of the gods have come down to us through much, much later stories like the Mabinogion in Wales. So Rhiannon, one of the characters in that, is meant to be Epona, who was a Celtic goddess. And so I kind of used bits from the Mabinogion to create the mythology of these characters and tried to create something that was different from ancient Rome, that would hopefully feel authentic to the time period, and drew on the history, but then created in the kind of gaps as well my own imagination of what the Druids might have been like.
Probably all we can do, really, as long as it's plausible and makes some kind of sense. Your earlier books are set in Pompeii, which is very Roman.
Yes.
How did you find the book that was less sympathetic to Rome compared to Pompeii? Were the Pompeii books about the eruption?
No, and I'd say that none of my book, I mean, I think ancient Rome was pretty grim. I'm obsessed with it, but I wouldn't say I'm sympathetic to the Romans. They were pretty awful. So with Pompeii, and I mean, Boudicca's daughter kind of came out of a side character from the Wolf Den trilogy, Britannica, who is an enslaved British woman who goes on to become a gladiator. And in Boudicca's daughter, we meet her as Senevara, her original name, because Britannica is her enslaved name, as a child who takes part in the rebellion. So there's that connection between the books. And one of the reasons I wanted to write Boudicca's daughter was the character of Britannica became one of my favourites, and certainly is the one that readers most often message me about as being their favourite. She stands out a lot in the Romanized world of Pompeii because of the way she's been brought up to see women as powerful and as able to, be warriors, essentially. And I just thought, well, I'd love to write a book where all the women are like Britannica, where she's the norm and not some alien. So that was the connection between the two. But the reason I wrote the Wolf Den trilogy was actually about the life of Pompeii rather than the death. So the eruption does happen in the third of the trilogy, but it happens partway through the third book. It's not the finale. And then I look at the refugee crisis afterwards. And with the Wolf Den trilogy, I started with the Lupana, which is the brothel, which means wolf den in Latin, and the sort of female characters and their different relationships with each other. And Amara, the main protagonist of that, she's a Greek woman who was enslaved due to her family becoming destitute. So she's not native to Pompeii. And it's really about her quest for freedom and what it means to be free in this society in this particular time. So the first book's her trying to escape the brothel, and then the second book is her life as a courtesan, and then in the third book she's a really, really powerful courtesan in ancient Rome with still her family connections and friend connections in Pompeii. So
yeah, and so you took a character that you found very interesting in Pompeii, and you had this opportunity to expand
yes,
into the British
Yeah.
Boudicca's world. That's really interesting.
And Pliny is a bridge character for both, because Pliny obviously took part as admiral of the Roman fleet in the rescue mission when Vesuvius erupted, and he died in that eruption. So, I had a fictitious Pliny who's present from book one, and then he's also present again in Boudicca's daughter because it's possible that he knew Paulinus, the general who defeated Boudicca. He quotes him in his natural history. So in my version, they're friends. And so we see Pliny through Paulinus's sympathetic eyes and Selina's very hostile ones. So that was quite fun as well, to have a character from both the trilogy and the standalone that you see from different angles, basically.
When you're writing characters in a historical setting, do you find it easier or more difficult the more information you have about them? Is it actually easier to write complete fictional characters, or do you find it equally difficult?
Yeah, I'd say there are different challenges. So rather than the characters, I would say I've learnt from Boudicca's daughter that I prefer making up my own events. So obviously the beats of the rebellion are fairly immovable. I mean, you could, obviously, if you're writing historical fantasy, which is a genre I enjoy, then you can move everything around.
Sure, yeah.
And even with historical fiction, you can move things around to a point, but, you can't have Boudicca win. That's not going to be historical fiction. That would be something completely different.
Yeah.
And that I found quite limiting. And I didn't enjoy the fact that I had to follow that. And I made it my own in other ways. Partly by not sort of overly focusing on the military campaign, but on the kind of emotional life and psychological stuff that's going on behind the scenes. And then, and similarly with Pompeii, Vesuvius doesn't erupt until book 3. And when I wrote The Wolf Den, the first in the trilogy, I honestly forgot at times that Vesuvius was ever going to erupt because people in the town didn't think it was going to. So I was very much in the heads of the people I was writing about. In terms of characters who are known, I do find it a bit daunting when it's somebody very famous. So that's one of the reasons I gave Boudicca a different name. She's Katia. So that my character, Katia, is somebody that I felt able to create. And Boudicca is the construct that she self-consciously adopts as a rebel leader because it means victory bringer.
Right.
Which is unlikely to have been her name right from the off, victory bringer. It sounds more like a military title. But who knows? It might have always been her real name, but some people do think that may not have always been her name. And so I changed her name, and that was a way of getting into the character as an individual and a creation and an imaginary person rather than trying to sort of follow exactly.
Because I suppose with a real historical figure, you've got those sort of guidelines within which you ought to write in some ways. I mean, you don't have to. If you're writing about a historical character, you can just make it all up. But I think there's almost an obligation to represent the historical figure somehow. But with a historical setting, you've got the beats of history to also write within. And that's a different restriction.
It is a different restriction. That one I feel, I'm quite a big nerd about. And I try really hard not to step too far. A, because we don't know, and B, it would just be too alien to write things completely from an ancient mindset. But I try very hard not to have characters step outside this kind of psychological framework of their era. So Amara in the Wolf Den trilogy, for instance, is never a feminist. So she fights for her own personal freedom and agency, but she's not got a kind of sense of women as an oppressed group, because that's not something that would have been available to her as an option. And similarly, none of the characters really question slavery, either the villains or the heroes. They want to not be enslaved. They don't want people they love to be enslaved, but they don't sort of set up a movement to try and overthrow Roman slavery. And then you've got all the sort of details of life.
What about language? What about conversation? How do you handle the historical figures having conversations with each other? Because some modern terminology would just stick out horribly, and some is necessary to communicate with a modern reader. How do you manage that?
Well, I think the real gift if you've got a different language. So it's very difficult if you're writing about medieval England, for instance, at a time when you can actually read Chaucer and know what medieval English sounded like. So then it becomes, Tudor England or whatever, it becomes much more challenging, I think. You can't write in that style because it would be incredibly jarring to read, but equally you can't go wild. I actually think with ancient Rome, you can go pretty wild because if you look at modern translations of someone like Catullus, who was really, when I was a teenager, he was kind of the reason why I became so fascinated with ancient Rome is because he's so slangy and sweary and colloquial. And
Okay.
I really like translations of particularly the lyric love poetry that are quite modern. So he'll use terms like girlfriend or, talk about going to bars or whatever. Because for the Romans, they were living in this very slangy, contemporary, modern world. They were living in the present day for them.
Yes.
So
I suppose it's a balance, isn't it? You've got to communicate them being living, breathing people in the present as far as they're concerned. They don't want to speak too formally either.
no, and you can't use expressions referencing objects that they self-evidently wouldn't have known. So I probably deliberately, because I saw The Wolf Den as being, it was a book in which I wanted to really upend how people thought about ancient Rome. So I really pushed the colloquial language to the absolute limit in that book. And I've probably been more restrained in the books since.
Right.
And that was also because of where it was set in a brothel. And I just felt like the pimp exclaiming by Jupiter or whatever, you girls have got to behave, would be absolutely absurd. So,
well, it would sound a little bit like Asterix,
Yes, exactly. And we've got all the graffiti in Pompeii as well, which is again incredibly colloquial and slangy and down to earth.
And graffiti, which seems to be prevalent throughout history, of people draw genitalia on walls all the time.
All the time. Nothing's changed there.
Just a human. I was thinking about the sort of language used as well, because obviously we've got Chaucer, and I was talking to a friend of mine who's a bit of a specialist in Latin, and he was talking about kind of formal Latin and informal Latin, so sort of high Roman Latin and street.
Yes.
And I saw the lovely idea of people speaking informal Latin as a street language. I think it's a sort of a really interesting, humanizing thing, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, Cicero's speeches that he recorded, and he's so pompous, Cicero. I mean, I really like Cicero's writing, but he is extremely pompous, would have been far more formal how he chose to write them down than what was actually delivered as well.
Yes.
So I suspect that formal Latin, although, you'd be pretty formal speaking to the emperor, surely, is also maybe more of a written thing than a spoken thing. Going just very briefly back to your original question about characters, I would say that I felt, because Nero becomes a fairly major character in the book later, I did feel very daunted writing him because, he's been portrayed so many times. So yes, that was just a side note, but yeah.
That's really interesting. I was doing my particular period of interest is the medieval, really, and is probably the high to the late medieval. And I was doing some research on Norman French because, of course, it was a form of French, but it was the French around the Ile-de-France in Paris considered the Normans to have a guttural and peasant sort of, even the high-ranking people had this terrible French, apparently. And I just love the idea that you've got Parisian French, yes, and you've got William the Conqueror speaking a sort of a bad form of French while conquering England and Hastings. I just love the idea that there's that juxtaposition, because we always think of people speaking in sort of proper English in historical situations, and they absolutely weren't. They were speaking their own funny accents.
Yeah, people have always looked down on other accents, all time frames,
We all have accents. It just depends on which one is more dominant in the media or seen as more extreme. And no accent's extreme. It's just what you're used to. It's just what you're used to hearing. So what about other periods in history? So do you have other books planned and other ideas? Are you going to stay with the ancient world and Rome and ancient Britain, or do you have ideas for new books?
So I think I am going to stay with the ancient world, at least for now. I can't say what I'm working on with my adult fiction at the moment, but I am writing a children's series set in ancient Rome, although it's a magical, fantastical version, because it's about Pliny the elder when he was young, when he was a child, but in this he can talk to animals.
Oh, wow.
So that's not terribly realistic. But yeah, apart from the animal talking, it is, straight historical fiction about Pliny as a child.
Is there anything I've missed out that you think we should touch on for listeners at all?
No, I don't think so. No, I think that's great. You've covered everything. I hope I haven't burbled on too much.
No, it's been fascinating. It's really interesting. I do like talking about the process of writing, and especially when something historical.
Yeah.
You've got the guardrails of actual history, but you've also got to try and make it interesting for a contemporary audience, and got to validate history, but you've also got to make it interesting from a reading perspective.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I like to sort of look at very different ways of looking at the world, which is maybe a bit morally grey or morally challenging, but there are certain dark areas of the past that I just don't want to look at.
I'd agree with that. I mean, there are times it's appropriate to write works about those, but it depends on the context of what you're writing, I think.
It does. And it's very much a personal thing as well in terms of what you want to spend time writing about.
Cool. So if people want to follow your work, do you have social media you want to let people know about?
Yes. My social media is pretty much just Instagram. I'm Elodie L. Harper on there. I also have a Substack that you can follow with the same, I think it's the same handle, but yes, Elodie Harper again. And elodieharper.com is my website. But the most kind of variety is on Instagram or my Substack. I should say as well, I would kind of want to do a bit of a shout out that, like a lot of authors, there are scammers that impersonate me from time to time. So if you ever get a message purporting to be from me via email or Facebook or just any kind of personal message out of the blue, it's not me. It's definitely not me.
It's a modern day problem. Keep your wits about you, everybody. Well, look, it's been absolutely lovely. Just quickly, your books, the Boudicca book.
Boudicca's Daughter is out at the moment in hardback, and it's published in paperback at the end of April in the UK. And in the US, it's out in paperback already.
Fantastic. Elodie, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much. And look forward to speaking to you again and reading more about the novels you make.
Thank you so much, Jason. I look forward to getting to medieval with yours as well. Thank you.